Welcome back to Silicon Wafers. Yesterday, we dipped our toes into the political storm engulfing Zelensky's administration. Today, we dive into the eye of the storm. For the first time since the full-scale invasion began, it's not only Putin's missiles or Trump's tantrums that threaten peace in Ukraine, but also what's happening inside Zelensky's inner circle. And this threatens to divide Ukraine and create internal animosity in a way that neither Russia nor the US could ever hope to achieve. The scandal is now inching closer to a man often described as Ukraine's other wartime leader, Andriy Yermak. Rumours of his fall may be premature, but even the fact that there are rumours and even open calls for him to go tells you about the intensity of the crisis. Before we dive into the story, thank you to everyone who supports the channel through Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee, especially as we gear up to run the last events of the year. It is a massive, massive help. So thank you very much. Now let's get back into the story. Zelensky's top aide could be sacked by Thursday. On November 18th, the Kiev Post reported that President Volodymyr Zelensky might fire Andriy Yermak, his close confidant and head of the presidential office, as early as Thursday, according to lawmakers. That's in Kiev Post. The story is based on Ukrainska Pravda's sources inside Zelensky's own Servant of the People party, who say the president has been canvassing options amid a political crisis triggered by gigantic corruption scandal in the energy sector. One unnamed lawmaker told Ukrainska Pravda that almost everyone in the faction is pushing the same solution: fire Yermak or risk the ruling party collapsing under the weight of scandal and public anger. This is alleged in the Kiev Post. Another MP, opposition figure Alexei Goncharenko, well known of course to viewers of this channel where he's appeared several times, went further still, saying bluntly that the Rada is talking about Zelensky firing Yermak on Thursday and floating former ambassador Oksana Markarova as a potential replacement. That's, again, Kiev Post story. So is this a done deal? No, it's far from certain, but becomes more likely as the pressure intensifies and as politicians and activists start to say out loud what they've only shared in private before. That not only might Yermak have dubious connections to the scandals that are unfolding, but that he has become an impediment to change, to reform and innovation. And these are desperately needed at this stage in the war. He has become a gatekeeper of the administration and Zelensky specifically, blocking dialogue and fresh thinking that are sorely needed to both tackle Russian aggression and disinformation, but also internal corruption and complacency. In some ways, complacency is even more dangerous and damaging. This is a war of will and logistics, as Ben Hodges reminds us in many of the interviews that we've conducted, but it's also a war of innovation, ideas and creativity. Anything or anyone that blocks this is a danger to victory. As of this recording on November 19th, there is no official confirmation from the presidential office. Some sources quoted by the Kiev Independent even suggest that law enforcement insiders don't believe Yermak will be fired, arguing that Zelensky is too dependent on him to govern. And in the absence of direct evidence against him, the pressure may not build to a sufficient level to force a change in the governing team. Well, that is from a long piece in the Kiev Independent. But the fact that this is being discussed in public by sitting MPs in the middle of Ukraine's largest wartime corruption scandal, well, this feels new. It lands on the same day that Parliament has just fired two ministers tied to that same energy scandal. Well, before we carry on with the scandal story, let's look into the details of who is Andriy Yermak. He was born in Kiev. He's 53 years old, trained as a lawyer at the Institute of International Relations, then spent years as a commercial lawyer and film producer before drifting into politics. That's from archive.ukraweekly.com. He wasn't a classic party apparatchik. He became part of Zelensky's circle through the entertainment and business world surrounding Kvartal 95. That personal bond turned into raw political power after Zelensky's 2019 landslide. That's from Kiev Independent. When Zelensky absorbed the old presidential administration into his new office of the president, Yermak was first an aide, then from February 2020, the head of the entire structure, with a seat on the National Security and Defence Council. That's from Liberty Radio Free Europe. And from there, his rise was relentless. The Financial Times has described him as Ukraine's other wartime leader, a hyper-powerful chief of staff who often acts like a co-president, running diplomacy, security and domestic politics from behind the scenes. Politico and Ukrainian commentators have called him a grey or even a green cardinal, the man who controls access to the president, manages appointments and arbitrates between oligarchs, ministers and security chiefs. That's from the Financial Times. The Kiev Independent's new deep dive profile puts it even more starkly. One analyst, Volodymyr Fisenko, tells the Outlook that Yermak is the main button on Zelensky's remote control. The same investigation notes that step by step, Yermak has been accumulating unprecedented power, de facto becoming Ukraine's second in command. Former staffers told the paper that Zelensky sets the broad political line, but Yermak runs the machinery of the state, shuffling ministers, directing the security services through loyalists like Deputy Chief of Staff Oleg Tatarov, and pushing out anyone deemed too independent or too popular, from former Commander-in-Chief Valery Zaluzhny to ex-Infrastructure Minister Alexander Kubrakov. Again, this is all from the Kiev Independent. At the same time, this is true. A Razumkov Center poll this spring found that only 17.5% of Ukrainians trusted Yermak, while 67% distrusted him. It is a brutal rating for someone effectively acting as co-ruler. Zelensky, by contrast, still hovers at around 60 to 70% trust, depending on the poll and the moment in the war. That's from Liga Novosti. And of course, these are figures that almost any Western leader would literally give their left arm for. This is a paradox. The most powerful, unelected official in Ukraine, Yermak, with extremely low public trust, at the center of every major decision, from diplomatic outreach to Trump's second administration liaison, to the alleged firing of generals, to the latest anti-corruption crackdowns. That's from the Kiev Independent. Rumours also suggest that many foreign leaders, diplomats and negotiators find Yermak very difficult and potentially irritating to work with. The current scandal is being read not just as a corruption case in the energy sector, but as a referendum on the Yermak system. And there is good reason to argue that a failure to deal decisively with corruption is now costing Ukraine money and authority. If it continues unchecked, it could cost foreign donors, foreign support, opportunities to make gains in the war, and of course, it could even cost lives. So let's turn to the anti-corruption Operation Midas, which looks at the $100 million scandal. Let's talk about the scandal itself, because this is the catalyst behind the calls to sack Yermak. On November 10th, Ukraine's National Anti-Corruption Bureau, NABU, and the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, SAPO, announced Operation Midas, a sprawling investigation into a kickback network inside Energoatom, the state nuclear energy company, and other energy entities. That's from Reuters. The scheme allegedly worked like this. Contractors seeking lucrative contracts to protect nuclear facilities from Russian missile attacks were forced to pay 10 to 15% kickbacks to a criminal group tied to senior officials. That's in the Washington Post. There have even been allegations of connections in this scam to Russian mafia interests. Over at least 15 months, this scam added up to around $100 million, siphoned off from a sector that is already under constant bombardment financial and physical strain. That's from Reuters. At the center of this web, according to NABU and multiple investigations, is Timur Mindic, a businessman, co-owner of Zelensky's old Kvartal 95 studio and a long-time associate. That's from Reuters. The NABU raids hit home. They hit Mindic's properties, the office and residence of Justice Minister Herman Holoshenko, formerly Energy Minister, and Energoatom itself. Mindic slipped out of the country hours before those searches. Holoshenko, sometimes referred to in wiretaps as Professor, appears in NABU audio where suspects casually discuss dividing kickbacks by 3 between themselves and the Professor. That's from the Kiev Independent. An anti-corruption prosecutor told a Kiev court that Zelensky himself phoned Holoshenko during one of the monitored conversations after Mindic texted the president, a detail that prosecutors say illustrates Mindic's access and political clout, even if Zelensky is not accused of any wrongdoing in the matter. That's, again, Kiev Independent. Public outrage was instant and volcanic. In a video address, Zelensky called corruption in the energy sector, already crippled by constant Russian strikes, absolutely unacceptable. He demanded that Parliament dismisses both Holoshenko and current Energy Minister Svetlana Hrinchuk, whose links to the same network raised red flags for investigators. Reuters notes that the government simultaneously moved to purge Energoatom's senior management. On November 19th, the Verkhovna Rada followed through. MPs voted to approve the resignations of Holoshenko and Hrinchuk, formally sacking them from the cabinet. The Kiev Independent describes the Energoatom case as the biggest corruption investigation during Zelensky's presidency. International reaction has also been sharp. A Washington Post op-ed by legal scholar Andriy Yermak calls Energoatom a threat from within, warning that the scandal is as dangerous as Russian missiles because it undermines Ukraine's war effort and its EU ambitions. Carnegie Endowment analysts say wiretaps from Operation Midas show the trappings of state capture, with networks around Mindic, Holoshenko and others treating a wartime energy monopoly as a private cash machine. We're not talking about some petty graft on the margins. This is a $100 million wartime scam at the heart of the energy industry, and it touches people very close to the president himself. Next, we look at the scandal and the alleged dotted line to Yermak. The Kiev Independent alleges a link between the Midas scandal and Bankova Street, the presidential office, and they specifically allude to Yermak. The Kiev Independent's investigation into Yermak and the scandal reports that, according to a law enforcement source, some of the diverted money was used to build 4 luxury houses outside Kiev. One of them, the source claimed, was intended for Yermak. That is an allegation. It's not proven in court, but it does fit a broader pattern. Yermak's former deputy, Andriy Smirnov, has been charged with illicit enrichment and bribery. 2 other deputies, ex-deputies, Kirilla Tymoshenko and Rostislav Shurma, have faced corruption probes. Yermak's former business partner, Artem Kalyubayev, has dramatically expanded his real estate and drone businesses during the war while landing large state support roles. Add to that the long-running scandal around Denis Yermak, the chief of staff's brother, who was filmed in 2020, allegedly selling state jobs. NABU ultimately closed the case in 2024, but the tapes and witnesses insisted that Andriy Yermak knew of the scheme, something he has vehemently denied. Again, Kiev Independent. And then there's the institutional power grab. Anti-corruption activists and MPs told the Kiev Independent that Yermak and his people drove this summer's attempt to weaken NABU and SAPO, pushing legislation that would have subordinated them to a political appointee. Protests in Kiev and pressure from Brussels forced a reversal on that policy. In other words, the same office, now insisting that it supports independent anti-corruption bodies, was only months ago trying to clip their wings, and are themselves potentially in the frame for anti-corruption research and future prosecutions. That's why people like Vitaly Shabunin of the Anti-Corruption Action Center are openly saying in interviews and on social media that there is, quote, no way Yermak didn't know what was going on around Energoatom and Mindich. He adds that if Yermak appears on future tapes like Holoshenko did, Zelensky will have no choice but to fire him. That is an extract from the article in the New Voice of Ukraine. Activist Daria Kalinyuk has gone further on X, accusing Yermak of enabling large-scale corruption and arguing that the real issue is the monopolization of power in the presidential office, not just one crooked businessman. Well, that's on X, formerly Twitter. On the streets, protests in Kiev have carried banners demanding no more green cardinals and calling directly for Yermak's resignation, while some demonstrators lash out at Zelensky himself for shielding his inner circle. It's not hard to see why, for many Ukrainian citizens, this feels like a kind of betrayal. Well, let's turn to Yermak's defense and the Zelensky dilemma. Yermak has consistently denied abusing his power. In a June interview quoted by Kiev Post from Politico, he insisted that accusations against him are not true and that his office is not a separate vertical of power, but a working tool of the president, especially during wartime when decisions must be made quickly and clearly. That's in the Kiev Post. After Operation Midas broke, Yermak publicly defended Zelensky, telling one outlet that the president is a man of great principle and not corrupt, and arguing that the very existence of the Energoatom investigation proves the independence of anti-corruption agencies. That's from Agenzia Nova. Pro-government commentators repeat a key talking point. Look, they say, this isn't Russia. And they do have a point. Russia is systemically corrupt, whereas Ukraine has a system afflicted by corruption. In Russia, corruption like this would be ignored, celebrated even, or quietly buried. And indeed, the whistleblowers, if such existed, would be literally buried. In Ukraine, NABU and SAPA and the High Anti-Corruption Court exist precisely to expose and punish these kind of misdemeanors, even when it hurts the president politically, and people working for them do not disappear like they would do in Russia. That's from the Washington Post. But it also puts Zelensky in a bind. If he fires Yermak, it's an admission that his chief of staff presided over, or at least tolerated, a system rotten enough to allow a $100 million energy scam in wartime. And this may be just the tip of the iceberg, as this is just one example in one part of a single industrial sector, albeit an important one. If Zelensky keeps Yermak, the scandals will be read in Kiev, in Washington, and Brussels as proof that Zelensky cannot or will not tear down the inner circle networks run by his friends and cronies. That's why the Kiev Independent editorial board wrote this week that Zelensky's leadership crisis is threatening Ukraine, warning that he must stop shielding his friends from corruption investigations and put the survival of the state first. Well, let's wind the episode up by looking at three potential scenarios, how this ends, and indeed how it may affect the war and disinformation reaction to the choices that are made. Kremlin propaganda and its proxies are already weaponizing this Energoatom scandal, pushing the line that Ukraine is terminally corrupt, that Western aid is stolen, that Ukrainians should give up. Well, of course, Russia is in no position to lecture anyone about corruption, and nor are its client states and puppets like Viktor Orban and Fico. Presidential advisor Mikhail Podolyak has warned that Moscow will try to use this case as proof that Ukraine is dysfunctional and undeserving of support. That's from Censor.net. And this is a spurious argument, in fact. Ukraine must survive and be victorious so that it has agency over its own future and destiny, so that it can purge itself of the inheritance of Russian and Soviet values, namely corruption and nepotism. De-Russification is a process that Ukrainians must internalize and embrace, and they are. It just requires time and effort to undo all the damage done when Ukraine was a colony of the Russian world. Well, let's look at the scenario. Scenario one, Zelensky fires Yermak. In this scenario, Zelensky accepts that the Yermak system has become politically radioactive. He sacks his chief of staff, reshuffles the presidential office, and hands more power back to an independent government headed by Prime Minister Yulia Sviridenko. A strengthened parliament is the result, and genuinely autonomous anti-corruption bodies. Well, this would be a shock both domestically and internationally, but it might stabilize Zelensky's servant of the people faction. It would undercut opposition calls for a full change of government. And it would reassure Western partners the Ukraine is serious about cleaning up its own house. This option could be even more powerful if veterans, representatives of civic society, and the high-tech industries were brought in to advise, consult, and participate in this national coalition. The risks? Well, in the short term, you lose an operator who has run everything from Trump diplomacy to weapons negotiations to prisoner swaps. And in wartime, that kind of disruption is dangerous. But of course, the danger of doing nothing seems to be far greater at this great inflection point of the war, and indeed the story of Ukrainian revolution and battle with corruption. Scenario two, Yermak survives, others take the fall. This is something of a default in Ukrainian politics and what some insiders still expect to happen. However, if we look at the last few years, many ministers and advisers have indeed resigned, been removed, and some have been prosecuted for their misdemeanours. Parliament has already fired Holoshenko and Khrushchev. Mindich has been sanctioned and is now an official pariah, sort of on the run. Energoatom's leadership will be purged. New faces will appear in the cabinet. That's from the Kiev Independent. But in this scenario, Yermak stays, and it may be difficult to persuade people to continue to trust the administration. Some MPs and Western diplomats might swallow this on the grounds that the war demands stability, but it will be a fragile and uncomfortable balance of the status quo. The problem is that everyone now understands the rot was growing in the shadow of the presidential office. Keeping the head of that structure while making cosmetic changes only deepens the cynicism and over time could undermine public trust in whatever solutions they're putting forward for the war or society and economy. And then lastly, scenario three, this is the worst one, slow erosion and fast collapse. This third scenario is the one no one wants, but plenty of analysts fear. Zelensky keeps Yermak. Operation Midas drags on for months. More tapes leak. Maybe someone somewhere produces a recording that directly implicates people even closer to Bankhovka, including Yermak. Public anger simmers. Opposition parties like European Solidarity and Holos ramp up calls for a reboot of the presidential office and even a new coalition government. Well, this is a scenario outlined by Kiev Post. In that environment, a misstep, another scandal, a battlefield setback, a clash with Trump could trigger a collapse of political support at home or abroad. This is a scenario to be avoided. But to round out this episode, here is my optimistic conclusion to this, because I think there is a way for this to end on a positive note. The first option may be more likely, in fact, as the scandal is moving very swiftly and the government is wary after the effective protests earlier this year. Zelensky remains broadly popular and has a far higher trust index among the public than Yermak ever has. He is also a powerful figurehead for the country with deep connections to foreign leaders and their publics. It would be a terribly destructive move to fully remove him from office. Ultimately, he is likely to choose power and country over his close associates. But I have another hope that this scandal does not go to waste, that it's used as a catalyst for change in the way Ukraine is governed and brings energy and transparency back into that governance. This in turn will accelerate the pace of reform, change and innovation. All of these are desperately needed in wartime and at such a critical phase in the war for Ukraine's survival.